Okay, so this begins our chapter. It's a pretty significant chapter. Our discussion of Karl Marx, and here we've got Marx pictured here, and first we kind of see him just sitting by himself. Then we have him seated with his collaborator and benefactor, um, Engels, and then here he is with his wife. I think, or is that his mistress? Actually, I don't know. That might be his wife. I think it's his wife. I don't think it's the mistress. Um, as I do with the others, let's talk about, let me just kind of, with this slide being here, just talk about Marx in general, and then we'll kind of work through the slides. So, Karl Marx, we're coming to the end of the classical school of economic thought at the point where Karl Marx is entering the conversation, and Karl Marx is writing two big texts. Well, one text is rather short, the other is quite long. But there's basically two key texts that Karl Marx writes that kind of sets up this transitional change from classical economics. And the first would be in 1848 when he writes the Communist Manifesto, and then the second part would come out when he writes the multiple volumes of Capital in the 1860s. 1880s. And so, well, he writes volume 1 in the 1860s. Volume 2, volume 3, and volume 4 come out in the 1880s, and then volume 4 comes out in 1910. So, as we start to talk about who Karl Marx is, it is rather helpful to first kind of talk about what the Communist Manifesto talks about. And so the Communist Manifesto is a rather short book. But what it basically did in 1848 is that, Karl Marx is looking at the situation that surrounds him. And what he's doing is he's, seeing a world where just a lot of things are changing. And the question would be why are all these things changing? What is it that's happening that's causing all of the old power bases, like a monarchy and whatnot, what's causing it to all change? What's causing all this revolution? Now, at the time that he's writing the Communist Manifesto in 1848, he's living in Paris. Paris had the revolution in the late 1700s, which would be kind of like Tale of Two Cities, that kind of French Revolution stuff. But, in France, in neighboring Belgium, even in Germany, you've got all these uprisings. And the communists at the time, what the communists are basically saying that the only way they can achieve their ends, the only way they can achieve their goals is to basically forcibly overthrow, forcibly revolt against all of the existing social relationships. And so those in power are obviously against that because they would basically be losing power. And Marx at this point has that statement in the Communist Manifesto that probably many people have probably heard about, which is he creates these different classes with the kind of the common person being known as the proletariat. And what he says is the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. So basically he creates, in the Communist Manifesto, as early as the Communist Manifesto, that basically we have a revolt of those in one social class against those in another social class. And he basically tells the proletarians, those in the lower social class, they should revolt because they have nothing to lose but basically their slavery, their chains. And and this wasn't just like idle talk. Those who were in power, they saw the threats around them, right? They see all these revolutions, so they certainly know that, time is coming to a close where they can kind of run things. And what, Marx's, even though he's writing this in 1848, which is clearly in the, classical realm of production, what's happening in the decades shortly after that is in England and especially in the United States, the economy and the scale of production in those countries is expanding rapidly. But what the Communist Manifesto, which is again the first major text that's written, what it does is it does set up this idea of there being social classes and that there needs to be a way to think through how history is proceeding and why it's proceeding in a certain way. The Communist Manifesto becomes the point in time in his writing of it where he starts to, where he meets and he starts to work much closer with Frederick Engels. That's the guy right here. And together, the two of them, are actually able to do quite a bit. Now, they're very different people, Marx and Engels. Marx, dude, look at the guy. He looks like a guy you shouldn't be messing with, right? He's looking long beard. He bit of a bigger guy, right? But he just looks, he looks like a badass, guy not to be messed with. There's all these other lines, there's all these other notions about him. He was really poor. He was really messy. Sadly, the stories I've read about how messy he is, I worry that I'm not much cleaner than him. Not as bad as like Adam Smith, but I don't know. Adam Smith, as we saw or heard in the lecture, as I remarked, he was a pretty messy guy, untidy guy. So was Karl Marx. So am I, but I'm not comparing myself to Smith and Marx here. I'm just saying I am disheveled. The thing where Marx really needed Engels, though, is Engels was really rich. Engels came from a rich family. He was actually pretty high up in the Manchester, England stock exchange. So he had a lot of money, and he gave his money and his time to Marx so that Marx could kind of complete the work that he had. And the reason why Engels was sympathetic to Marx is that Engels himself, in 1844, had written a book called The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844. And when Engels, to write that book, he almost did an analysis a lot like Adam Smith. He in northern England, Manchester, England, he basically went to every factory and he just looked at just how the cities were organized, how the factories were organized, and how badly all these things were organized. And what he wanted to do is Engels, when he wrote The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844, what he wanted to do is he wanted to show the English economists, the classical economists, he wanted to show them, what kind of society they had unfortunately created for us. And Engels was so mad about these really bad working conditions that he wrote this book, and the book ended up being read by Karl Marx, who was at the time living in Paris, and he was like editing this a pretty radical magazine, basically communist magazine, and Marx had read the works of Engels, and basically Engels and Marx started to talk to each other a lot more. Now the question becomes one of, why is Marx editing basically a magazine / newspaper in Paris at the time? It turns out that Marx had been trained as a really strong. He was trained to be a philosophy faculty member. And actually, he was about to get, and this was in Germany, and he was about to get an appointment to a pretty important academic position. But then the person that was supposed to appoint him had turned out to be really radical, and the government basically got rid of that guy. And so now Marx had no person that would give him this strong recommendation so that he could just kind of stay in academia. And that when Marx was studying as a philosopher, he had taken a strong liking to the work of Hegel. And Hegel was this philosopher who tried to understand how change exists. And that basically change is inevitable, and that change represents this kind of existence, this dual existence of one thing on one end and this other thing on the exact opposite end. This change was dialectical, and that becomes an important word for us, dialectical. So you have these two countering things in that society can move between these two countering things. So we have what we would call a Hegelian dialectic, or just kind of a dialectic in general, this movement from one thing to another. Now, when you think then about Karl Marx, person trained to talk about Hegel, person trained to talk philosophically and theoretically about dialectics, what does the guy do once he can't stay in academia anymore? Well, he basically becomes a journalist. The problem for Marx is that whereas the university system and the academy generally tolerates people being radical, the real world does not. And so what we'll see here in the story of Marx's life is that he goes through this series of jobs because his radicalism basically keeps getting him fired. And the thing is that as radical as Marx was, it turns out that Engels was even more radical, politically radical. And that Engels had the money to back up what he believed in. And so he provides the fuel, both the passion, Engels provides both the fuel, both the passion and the money to Marx for him to kind of basically work through his things. And together, Marx, again, trained philosopher, Engels, this person with the very strong political beliefs, Marx and Engels together create a new philosophy, a new field of philosophical thought. That's a pretty big deal. And part of what made it new was that it combines politics and economics together. So we got that kind of political economy, this classical notion of political economy that we saw even with the ancient Greeks. But he also takes on all of these things that Hegel had been talking about with this dialectical nature. And Marx and Engels together create this understanding of history that is based on materialism, on physical goods. And what they call this is dialectical materialism, where there's this inherent change, that's the dialectical part, that comes from Hegel, but then it's dialectical materialism because we're not going to talk about ideas anymore, rather we're going to talk about physical things. So this dialectical materialism, which is what Marx and Engels are working on together, they then decide to reread all of history through the lens of this dialectical materialism. Meaning, they're going to start to try to read history and predict the future based on this notion that there is inherent change in the world, and this inherent change is affecting basically the production and primarily the production of different goods. And in that materialist conception of history, what they believe, why do you focus on products in the productive process? They do that because Marx and Engels believe that the social order that exists in society comes from production, and that this production, comes down to, you kind of remember when you took Principles of Economics and you talk about those kind of three major economic questions, right? Like, what's going to be produced, how is it going to be produced, who is it going to be produced for? Notice that in those three questions I just said, the word produce was in all three of those questions. And what Engels and Marx are basically arguing here is that you can then read history as society coming up with different answers to those three questions of what is produced, how is it produced, who is it produced for. And so what this dialectical materialism and the way that it influences this answering of these three basic economic questions, well, then we can look at how things change over time, right? So basically what Marx needs to do then is try to understand the present as this kind of compilation, basically, of the time of society changing from one way of answering these questions to another. And so when you look, when Marx is looking at the conflict that exists in the current moment, what he's looking at is this idea that we used to have a feudal way of life, right? You had people, in the feudal system, we had people, working on land that they did not own, and they would basically produce stuff, share some of their production with the feudal landowner, but basically the ownership of the land is what gave you power, right, and created that dependency. And as we talked about like with Bentham and Mill, with the classical economists, what they were concerned about was that this idea of a market, this idea of a factory system, isn't compatible with the feudal way of life. And so what that means is that if the feudal way of life ceases to exist, and now it's going to be the factory and these modes of production, we need a new social class to basically, and a new society to understand this transition in the economy. So basically we have old social classes, the feudal landowner and the serf, right? Because the feudal system had lords and serfs. The lords and serfs are going to be replaced. The lord and serf in the feudal system for Karl Marx is going to be replaced with the capital owner and the worker. Or, as you may have heard it, the bourgeois and the proletariat. But the conflict still exists. Just as there was conflict between the feudal lord and the serf, there's going to be conflict between the capital owner and the worker. And that's all that we're kind of seeing. It's just that now we've also got this change in what the feud is about. So when you go back to the Communist Manifesto in 1848, the revolution that we see all around us is really because the base of the economic system, this idea that there is industrial production, is no longer aligned with the rest of the structure, where that rest of the structure is one where we're going from a lord and a serf and lord system to one where people own private property and they get to own a little bit of that. They get to own a little bit extra of that. That the conflict exists between the capitalist and the worker in this realm of production. In the Communist, so we're still kind of on the Communist Manifesto. We're not actually getting yet to Marxist text, Capital. We haven't even gone through the slides here. But what the Communist Manifesto does is that it talks about this kind of evolution of the society and of the economy, and that basically there are these stages. And his belief was that capitalism will basically destroy itself, that it will create a successive system, and that successive system is socialism. The belief here was that basically you've got all of these really big factories that are going to produce a lot of stuff. They're going to make all of this stuff that we can then use those riches to train people well, and that eventually capitalism will fall, and we'll use our methods of knowing how to produce lots of stuff and have lots of really smart people that know how to manage that process. Well, now they could be socialists, where basically they produce for the benefits of all of society. And so, what we take from that, right, that becomes like the next, about 15 years after he finishes writing up, the Communist Manifesto, he's spending his time in England. And in England, what he's working on is the big text, Das Kapital, Capital. And originally, right, so 1848 Communist Manifesto was published. Originally, he thought it was only going to take him a few weeks. So he's starting this writing earnestly in about 1850, 1851. And basically he writes and writes and writes until 1863, I think. But it's finally in the early 1860s when he gets Volume 1 of Capital done. Volume 2 comes out 2 years after Marx had passed away. He had written the manuscript kind of sloppily, hand wrote it out, and Engels kind of finished it up and got it published in 1885. Volume 3 comes out in 1894, so that would be about 11 years after Marx died. And Volume 4, the last volume, doesn't come out until 1910. That'd be 27 years after he had passed. 2,500 pages, it's a big book. I admittedly have not read any of those volumes in any depth. I went to graduate school with a guy who did, who kind of fashioned himself as pretty Marxist. I just don't know what he ever got out of doing all that. And again, we're going to go through these slides here, but let me kind of give you this idea of what he's trying to do in Capital before we get to everything here. Is that, Marx, he's read the work of Adam Smith. He's read the work of the classical economists. And what he saw in those, right, is that people were looking for values. What is the value of something, right? And so, if you remember, Smith had this whole idea that you've got this capitalism, you don't have any of these monopolies or unions, and you've got this force of competition that's driving prices down. And then you get individuals like Ricardo that say that basically the value of a commodity is basically embedded within it, right? So for Marx, he would say that the value of something is basically the embodiment of the labor within it. And what Marx does is he basically says that in that scheme of producing something, that those who are the capitalists are really greedy and they just want to accumulate a lot of wealth. And what they do is that they own the machines. They own the factory. And it's by virtue of their property. It's by virtue of the fact that they own the means of production, the factory, the machines, the land, that they can tell the worker to work more. The worker isn't going to get paid necessarily, well, they won't get paid the value of what they put into their work. Rather, they're going to only get paid enough so that they come back to work tomorrow. Meaning we'll pay them enough for their food, pay them enough so that they don't get too pissed off, and we'll pay them enough that they come back to work again tomorrow. But not more. What that means is that for Karl Marx, well, for Adam Smith, if you made a profit, the profit would go away because of competition. For Marx, the profit doesn't go away. The profit can continue to exist because of that exploitation that exists between the owners of the means of production, the capitalists, and the workers. That work that the worker does that isn't compensated is called the surplus value. And that surplus value that's captured by the capitalist is used to create even more exploitation by creating even more machines and whatnot. And so, Marx takes all of this then to basically, that kind of understanding of what capitalist society is to build an entirely new economy, or basically talk about how the economy will change over time. Okay, let me pause here just so I can rest a little bit, and then I'm going to get into the rest of this. Okay, so now we get into the slides here. So much of this I already had kind of talked about here, but it's good to have it obviously written down. Marx is originally German, and he basically is trained to be able to go to be an academic, a university professor. And he was a philosophy student, and he had worked pretty closely to understand more closely Hegel. He joined this club, this university club called the Young Hegelians, and the nature of what Hegel again focused on was this nature of change and why change occurs and how it can be understood. And again, for Hegel, this key idea was that there's a dialectic, this counter, these countering forces or these countering positions that we kind of move between. Marx's academic career comes to an end when basically his advisor, his mentor, gets fired because he was a radical. That'd be Bruno Bauer. And that's when Marx turns to journalism. But again, Marx and being a journalist, he just keeps getting fired. Starts a radical journal and he gets fired, at least in Germany. Then he goes to Paris. And eventually he gets kicked out of Paris. And he goes to, I think he goes to Belgium after Paris. And in these, so in these years where he had just finished his academic career, and he's out in the real world, he marries someone rich, which is generally what you need. Jenny von Westphalen. He actually loves her quite a bit, even though he does have this, even though he does end up hooking up with, I think, the maid, which is, I guess, a classic thing here. He ends up hooking up with the maid, but he still really loved Jenny a lot, and Jenny loved him. And, she supports him. And it turns out that Marx, even though he did that one bad thing of basically having an affair, he's actually at least the reports say that he was a pretty good dad and a pretty good husband. But when he moves to Paris and he's working on this Communist Manifesto, he does meet Frederick Engels. Engels, who again was rich from England and just had significantly more resources, but also more passion for things. Gets kicked out of Paris, where he was writing for a magazine, and he basically moves to Brussels, where he then gets kicked out again and moves back to Germany, which at the time then had different leaders. So the new leaders forgot that he had been kicked out, but it didn't take him very long. Because in 1848, when he's in Germany, he finally gets the Communist Manifesto published, along with Frederick Engels. But Germany's getting a little bit worried now because there had been a riot already, uprisings in France. And so Germany's seeing this and like, dude, why do we want this guy still staying in our country? Let's get him out of here. And so they kick him out in 1849. Saying that he's going to incite or cause armed rebellion. And so he has to move to London. It's not a bad place to be. And I've actually seen where he lived in London. It's actually a pretty cool area of London, so he at least moved somewhere cool. So then from 1849 to 1883, right, that takes us through the rest of his life. The key one that we know would be Capital, which, he finishes at least volume 1 before his death, and then 2, 3, and 4 come from the rest of the things that he wrote. Engels putting together 2 and 3 based on the notes that Marx had collected, and then Karl Kautsky putting together volume 4 from whatever else he could kind of put together from what had been written. In this time period, he also writes the Critique of Political Economy and the Grundrisse. These are kind of all leading up to Capital. He does all of his research by going to the British Museum, which is a beautiful place if you've never been. I have, fortunately. And it's just a beautiful reading room within the library. And he would basically work in this library from like 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. Every day that the library was open. Basically just writing all of these notes. Yeah, dude, it was pretty bad, though. Always poor. Always trying to hunt down more money. Jenny, yes, she was rich, but, she had her own kind of nervous breakdowns. But these nervous breakdowns are just also caused by their abject poverty, because basically Marx is spending all of his time just writing stuff in the library, right? He's not actually like doing a job and earning money. Jenny dies in 1881. Engels actually visits Marx shortly after. He's like, dude, Marx is going to die soon, too. And Marx does die in 1883. But when we put together the Communist Manifesto, when we put it together with the Critique of Political Economy, and then we put that together with Capital, we have this notion, this view of the world, of society and the economy, that's very different from how Adam Smith saw it. And the difference comes about because Adam Smith is looking at things, and Adam Smith is seeing that, capitalism leads to prosperity, that capitalism leads to all of these positive changes. For Marx, capitalism is temporary. It's just something that happens in this phase of development, but it will change to something else. And the way that he then again understands history, just to repeat myself then, is this through this idea of historical materialism, which again means that we're looking at the world through this notion of production. But that also what we're doing is looking at the world not only through production, but through dialectics, moving from one thing to the other. And again, that dialectic materialism, or those dialectical contradictions, that's the Hegel. Hegel is obviously omnipresent in the mind of Marx, and Marx just brings out that Hegel dialectic into the means of production. And so that's what we get when I talk about here the basic categories of the theory, is that you look at the key economic questions that that exist. And in this world that exists, the idea is that what's going to be produced, how is it going to be produced, who's it going to be produced for, all of that is in this world where we have to organize. Sorry, I'm not sure why my Google device is telling me that the weather is 78 and partly cloudy. But what you're seeing is that in those means of production, we also have our social relations of production. Again, we've got classes. We've got a class of people that own the means of production, and then we have a class of workers. We have to just put all those things together. So again, in our forces of production, we've got the workers, we've got the machines, tools, raw materials, factories. All of these inputs go into the production. You have to now organize this production, and you have to think of the institutions that are going to support the way that things are produced, exchanged, and distributed. And that you do that, through this class structure. These social relations shape the class structure by which things are produced. And this class structure, this superstructure, isn't constant. Rather, it changes. And it changes, right, in sometimes a quite violent way. So it's stable for a really long time. And this would be things like the government, the judicial system, the military, that gives stability to society, the legal system, the laws. And then all of a sudden, it just dramatically changes, right? And there again would be some of our dialectical materialism. Okay, and so what we start to see here is that as things change in the social relations, the superstructure changes. there's a feedback loop between the two. And so the superstructure changes, and then the superstructure also, so the superstructure changes because of changes in social relations, but also the superstructure creates changes in social relations. So there's our loop, right? Things define and redefine each other. And we have kind of one of the key lines here. Changes in the mode of production facilitate changes in the superstructure. That's what gives Marx this better understanding then of why we're seeing the changes that we are, for instance, in 1848 and whatnot. And that would be that it comes from this idea that as the mode of production changes from being, large industrial structures with a factory system, well, then of course the superstructure is going to change because we no longer have the feudal lord-driven system. And so there we go. The forces of production are changed by the social relations of production, which are changed by the superstructure. But then, as you kind of see here, it is a feedback loop. So the whole social formation is this loop between the superstructure, the social relations of production, and the forces of production. A loop between the three. And so, right, in this idea of this dialectical materialism or this historical materialism, the change are these arrows as the things are changing over time. And what we can see from the Vaggi and Groenewegen text, which again I'm not having you read, but in my kind of summary of it, we basically can understand history as having three major modes of production. And that would be the ancient mode of production, a feudal mode of production, and then a capitalist mode of production. So in the ancient mode of production, we see that that's largely oriented around slavery. In that slavery, basically what we see is that getting to own others and restricting their compensation from it. You can understand that the slavery, which is our means of production, then justifies the superstructure. That Plato and Aristotle say is that some people are just kind of destined to be slaves. It's slavery based on human nature. Which gives way to the feudal mode of production where you don't have slavery anymore, but basically now you have people that have obligations. And these people have obligations to the state, and that laborers also have obligations to the landlords. And that you can, again, create a legal, legal and judicial system that justifies that, but you also have a superstructure, where the superstructure also kind of creates that further justification for why the feudal relations exist. Which gives rise to the time period where Marx is existing, and that would be our capitalist mode of production, where we have private property, workers who are free to sell their labor, but the workers just can't do things on their own. They need the owners of the means of production to be able to produce things meaningfully. And you've got the owner of the capital who takes a risk, and taking that risk is what justifies their profit. So there's our kind of superstructure. And so the history of the world is these production modes transitioning from one to the other, and that transition mode may take a while, but eventually it does change. And so that change that we see is we just go from one system to the other, with generally a crisis causing that change, with Marx saying that such a crisis exists right now in capitalism. So there was going to be something after capitalism. That capitalism is going to give way to socialism, and that socialism is going to give way to communism. So socialism and communism are not the same things. Socialism comes from the fact that as the society gets bigger and bigger, you get more trained people who can kind of manage the production process and who would then start to work for basically the benefit of everybody. But eventually, even at that point, people aren't going to necessarily do things for the greater good out of any obligation as they might under socialism, but it needs to give rise to just a new method of thought in why we do things, which is more communal, hence the term communism. Marx doesn't talk a great deal about what exactly socialism and communism is. So, and Marx didn't really care very much. I mean, at least with Volume 1, all that we really get is Marx's idea that capitalism isn't going to last forever, and it's eventually going to give way to something else. And he says that these other things are socialism and communism. It takes the others, like Lenin and whatnot, to kind of take this forward and to bring out what socialism and communism is. Okay, let me pause here for a few moments. Okay, so when he's writing up Capital, then his basic priority is to basically find the ways that we understand how capitalism kind of continues to exist over time. And so Marx, as I had identified earlier, he looks at these things as embedded values. He took that idea from Ricardo, and that he basically said that things that are produced have labor embodied within them. And that these means of production are promoted by social relationships that exist. So the social relationships that exist kind of perpetuate this capitalist mode of production. And so then Marx also, and this is important, he's also then going to take from the physiocrats, from Smith, and again, as well as Ricardo, that he sees, what capitalists are doing as accumulating their wealth, and that what emerges, why capital becomes important, or why even the name of the text is Capital, is that capital is what then creates the relationship between the commodities that are produced, the value of these products, and whatever their exchange value is, or their price. And so what he does here is to do this all in Capital, what he has to do is he creates distinctions, a distinction between a use value, an exchange value, and just value itself. The use value would be, right, that it meets some sort of need that people have. The exchange value would be just its price. And just the overall general term of value would be something about the labor that's embodied within it. And that part of this as well is that in this production process, that there's both useful value and abstract human labor. The abstract human labor would be, in this term, I'll just silence my things here. That in this abstract human labor, we kind of remove all the differences that can exist over time, and we just look at kind of very general, raw sense of labor that exists. And then we take from that as well this idea of the useful labor, which is in some sense taking into account that there's a specific skill or attribute exists that makes it more valuable. Okay, so that gets us to then, labor power. So labor power would be the worker's capacity, ability to work. That's what's sold, right? Now, the idea is that the worker can choose to work a lot, really intensely, or not at all, right? So we could either be talking about number of hours worked, but we could also be talking about the intensity of what you have to get done in a certain amount of time. And we kind of see that kind of thing even today, right? Like, especially if you work for like a big retailer, like a Target or something like that, where they give you your tasks you have to do, and it contains like more tasks than you could reasonably accomplish in a period of time. All right, that gets to, the worker can do different amounts of things in different amounts of time. What's going to come on the capitalist is defining how many, what are the obligations in terms of the hour worked, and what has to get done. And what Marx then creates out of this is what's known as the circuits of exchange. And what this does is, it creates, when we want to look at how value is created, in a pre-capitalist society, one, before capitalism kind of emerges, think of, again, just kind of a simpler time, all that people did is they engaged in simple commodity production, right? And people would produce things and then exchange these goods produced for other goods, right? So commodities are produced, right? We buy those commodities with some form of money, even like the Middle Ages, right? Even back to like Roman and Greek times, there's money, drachmas and whatnot. So, right, commodities are produced, and they're, I give them money, and then I use that money to buy some other commodity, right? And at this exchange, the CMC, this is creating for us our use values, our way of approximating how valuable something is in terms of its usefulness. This form of exchange is all regulated by, managed by the labor that's embodied in these things. But what's different here is that there's not as much private property, so there's more common property in this kind of society. And the work, right, especially if you go back to the Romans and the Greeks, the labor is free, right, because there would be, in some sense, slavery. When we bring that out to capitalism, though, the circuit of exchange has now changed, right? Which again would be kind of a key term here for Marx. And the way that it's changed is that now money, right, is exchanged for a commodity, which is now exchanged for money again. And what he says, and this is the last bullet point here, he says that it would be absurd if those two M's were the same number. Meaning, right, where's the other value coming from? If they're not the same, if the one M on the left is not the same value as the M on the right, where is that extra amount going to, and what generated it? If this is the circuit of exchange that exists under capitalism. Because Marx says that the two M's are not equal, what we get is MC M prime, where M prime is greater than the original M, and that the difference between M prime and M is known as the surplus value. That surplus value, that's basically the extra wealth that's generated in capitalism. And then the question is, right, at least for Marx, is what creates that difference? What creates that surplus value? Why is M less than M prime. Which then would lead to the next question of who owns the surplus value? Who's capturing it? And basically what he says, he goes on for a really long time about it, but basically he says that the M prime is greater than M, not because of like monopolies or some other weird competitive forces. Rather, M is not the same as M prime because of the way that production is organized. And that basically that workers work, for a great deal of the day, and they earn a wage which is just enough to get them to come back to work, their subsistence wage, but they end up working more hours than what that subsistence wage would have required. And that the capitalist owns those extra hours or that increased intensity that the worker put into their job. They're only getting paid a fraction of the value that they're delivering for the products they produce. And I mean, I guess if you think about it, right, I mean, we've probably all felt that at some point. I mean, I certainly feel like that even in a class like this, right? You're all paying tuition. If I added up all that tuition, it would definitely equal a lot more than what I'm getting paid as a worker. So, right, I mean, at least so far you could read this, and get, grumpy with your employer because of it. So, the value of the commodity, M, is then equal to C, V, and S. C being the value of the capital itself, plus the value of the labor power, plus the surplus value. So basically everything produced, right, and let's give it a price, let's say $15, is going to contain 3 different components. It's going to contain the labor within it, that's the V. It's going to contain some value given to it by the means of production, the capital, the stuff that's owned by the capitalist, like the factory, the manufacturing process, the machines, whatnot. And then there's the S. Who owns the S? Well, again, we're going to have to talk about that. But right, I mean, this, so if I wanted to look at, like, again, our class and see all of you paying the tuition, well, I have to admit, right, we do have a physical campus, right? Even though this could be an online class, there's still a physical campus that has to be paid for, and whatnot. And I can't only have to think about my actual wage. I would also probably want to have to look at, like, the benefits I receive, like health and retirement and whatnot. But again, I still suspect, right, if I still suspect that there's some S, some surplus value, I might want to try to capture that with either a higher wage or less work. And that is really, in the end, at the end of the day, when you think about what, like, at least what we're seeing around us today, when we look at, like, what unions do, right, where they kind of collectively organize all the workers, it's generally a debate between the union and the employer over what the amount is of the S and who should get to own a portion of the S. So again, the C does get used up over time. That's our depreciation here. So that's the capital. Again, the workers are the V. The S is the surplus. So with all this said, right, we can kind of do a very simple, quick calculation here that if it takes 5 hours of work just so to be able to, subsist as a worker, and the the time of the working day is 8 hours, then there's 3 hours of surplus, right? And the value that we pay for the things is, in this case, 13. So C plus B plus S, right, gives us a value for the M. And what Marx creates for us, or mathematizes for us, is a rate of exploitation, which is just going to be S over V. And so what S over V is going to tell us is, based on the exchange that occurs in the labor market, me deciding how many hours I'm going to work and what I'm going to be compensated for it, that exchange value isn't going to be equal. There's going to be some exploitation. That surplus value is going to exist because I feel obligated, or I'm legally required to work in different ways beyond what I'm getting compensated to be able to subsist. So why is that happening? Well, the employer, they just want to get, they just want even more money, right? They want to own even more of the surplus value. So what they're going to do, again, is they're going to either make the working day longer, or they're going to do things that have to make the worker work faster. You could look at like a new technology like Slack, which is a pretty cool tool if you're like doing teamwork and stuff like that. But it could also be pretty bad because it forces you to be working at home and off hours and whatnot. Zoom is a cool technology, but it can force you to, do meetings, off hours, impromptu and whatnot. Employers might like it, but it's really just designed to make me more productive as a worker. Or maybe the employer doesn't like me working at home because they can't monitor me as closely. So then, right, they don't know if I'm as productive as I otherwise am. And so if this V over S is our rate of exploitation, then either you would try to, if you were an employer, try to not make your employee think of things that way, say like, oh, your compensation is actually much bigger than you think it is. Or if I was the employer, I would try to control the way that I would try to manage that exploitation so it doesn't become so bad that you quit. Which becomes really important if we have a tighter labor market. And the reason why Marx differs from others is that what Marx believes is that it's actually one of the things that tends to be good here is that if you have all these extra workers created by machines, right, that machines displace workers and the workers then are without a job, the problem is that those workers who are unemployed are always waiting on the sidelines, just waiting for an opening so that they can get that job. And the workers who are working know that. So this, what Marx calls this industrial reserve army, exists, and it keeps the wages low because the workers will take on worse and worse positions, like more hours, less pay, because if they reject that and they revolt against that, then there's like a line of workers who will take their job happily from them. And so they accept it because something's better than nothing. And so Marx, as he's spending his time, in the British Library, kind of documenting all these things happening, he, spends a great deal of time talking about how capitalists have, made all these efforts to kind of try to increase the length of time of the workday and whatnot. Marx is looking at Jean-Baptiste Senior, this politician who was talking about part of the 1836 Factory Act, which was designed to like try to make the working day not as long as it used to be. Right, and you kind of see these kinds of debates about that intensity. It's not that we don't see those kinds of things today either, by the way. The examples that I see, for instance, would be one of the examples I read was, if you work at an Amazon factory, like a warehouse, you have to go through this process where you change into a uniform, or if you're not changing into a uniform, you have to go through like a security scan to make sure you're not like walking out with stuff and whatnot. But there can be a really long line to go through this security line. So the question would be is, when do you clock in? Are you clocking in before you have to wait in that long line, or after? And what Amazon was saying, you clock in after, right? So you'd end up having to show up to work earlier to wait in that long line, only then to clock in, right? And so the workers who aren't unionized had to file lawsuits and do this thing to talk, to try to limit Amazon's ability to, elongate the working day by making workers wait in this long line for something. And you see other things too, where workers, complain maybe they didn't get a lunch break, or maybe they didn't get a 15-minute break. Or maybe they didn't even get vacation pay. All these kinds of things work into that process. So the capitalist owns this surplus value, and they accumulate it over time. And so this leads to Marx talking about three consequences to this accumulation process. Is that the capitalists, who are all competing strongly with each other, they use that surplus value to get bigger and bigger. So they're absorbing the weaker firms. But eventually, taking from Adam Smith and from Ricardo, what happens is that that rate of profit eventually falls. And as that rate of profit falls, then the capitalist feels under even greater pressure. And as the capitalist feels under greater pressure, what they do is they replace the workers with even more machines. Right? And so basically, capitalism becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, yet requires fewer and fewer workers. And what that requires, all right, is that as these workers become fewer and fewer and fewer, then the capitalists have to buy even more and more capital. But that causes an even greater fall in the rate of profit, just because you're buying more and more of the capital, the reward to it's going to be smaller and smaller. And it creates this overall cycle, this chain, where it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the profit that comes from having that big system falls and falls and falls. And so this becomes kind of a Marxian notion then of what creates like a business cycle. Is that you get these recessions and whatnot, basically as the economy adjusts itself. And so from there, what we get is this underconsumption. This underconsumption and the low wages to workers basically ends up creating an even larger crisis in the system that leads to the eventual socialism and communism that Marx thought would exist. Okay.